Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our basic Christianity, and we'll be continuing on our series. The previous lesson we talked about faith, belief in God, and for today, the topic of our lesson will be about the Christian faith. We're going to do an exploration and to talk about the different perspective about our Christian faith. So the scope and objectives of our lesson is number one, to really understand Christianity from a worldwide perspective. So we will be comparing with other major religions. And these are the three objectives that I hope that we will get out of the whole lesson. We're going to see the historical context and see how Christianity fit into the world religions, so that we will have a better understanding about our own Christian faith alongside with the other faith. And then finally, I hope that after this whole study about our Christian faith, you will really get to appreciate our own Christian faith. Let me first start off with reading a verse from Acts chapter 17, verse 22 to 23. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walk around and look carefully at your objects of worship, I found even an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you." So from this verse, we see that Paul was talking to the Athenians, and he noticed as he walked around the city of Athens that they had many idols and many different type of gods, and there was even an idol named the unknown God. Isn't that very interesting? And you find that many people today, we worship God, but we don't really know who God is. And so Paul tells them that what is unknown to you, I'm going to proclaim and to teach you. So in the same way, that's the objective of this particular segment of our Basic Christianity series, is that I hope that through this lesson, you will really get to see our God in the Christian faith, and not to be confused with all the different religions and all the different gods out there. So we're going to talk about four things in this particular section. First, we're going to compare all the major philosophies and movements in our world. Secondly, we're going to talk about primitive religion. And thirdly, we're going to talk about the major organized religion that we have currently in this world. And finally, we'll end up talking about the appreciation of our own Christian faith. So hopefully by comparing all these different philosophy, movement, religions, we'll really get to see why we believe what we believe and why we appreciate the faith that we have. So let's first start off with focusing on the major philosophies and movements. Even though this particular area is not so much about religion, not so much about faith in God, but it is still very important because this is something that many people believe in. And many people, call it so-called their religion, and they follow it. So it's important for us to understand all the different major philosophies and movements that are right now in our world. So there are four of them that I want to mention. Philosophies. There are many. So first one is transcendentalism. So what is this about is that this particular philosophy people tend to believe the truth based on their own understanding and their own intuition. In other words, whatever their feeling is telling them, that they feel like this is the truth. Whatever their mind is telling them, and they feel like, yes, this is the concept that I need to follow. Or whatever that they hear around that they feel like it's reasonable according to their intuition. They believe that is their truth. So there's no particular standard. And individual intuition is the truth. And then secondly, you probably heard of the New Age movement. This started off mainly after World War II, where people kind of lost the concept of God or lost faith in God. And so, but yet in their heart, they want to be spiritual, but they do not want to follow an organized religion. So, New Age movement is very popular today in our world. Third one, another philosophy of movement is naturalism. This explains our world, the creation, without God. They look at the mountains, they look at the trees, they look at the animals, and they look at nature, and they see nature in terms of a spiritual form. But they do not want to believe in God. And finally, very popular among all of us is secularism. And what is that? Basically, they interpret life solely from the material world, whatever that they can see, our material world. And there are more philosophies and movements and ideas from different teachers that goes around, and people tend to want to follow them rather than follow God. So let me read to you a verse that talks about that in Acts chapter 17, verse 16 to 21. And you'll find that this concept of philosophies and movement is not new. In fact, it already started back even in the time of Paul and the apostles. So in verse 16, it says here, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began the debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remark, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to the meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and foreigners who live there spend their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. So we find here philosophies, movements, latest ideas. They were not new. They were even present during the time of Paul, where people gathered together. And for the Athenians, they gathered together in this particular place called the Areopagus, where they'll come together and discuss their belief, their ideas, their philosophies, and what principle they should follow. So, brothers and sisters, that's one particular area that people tend to follow today, their own belief, their own philosophies, rather than our God. Secondly, we're now going to investigate into the second area about world religion, is the area of primitive religion. So before we get into the current organized world religion, it's good for us to go back to the past just to understand what the ancients, what the people of old used to believe, the primitive people. The main ideas of primitive religion is that there is a strong belief in magic and superstitions. We see that, don't we, even in the current time. There is no particular God or gods, but rather there is a strong belief in the spirit world. There's a belief in spiritual power in association with animals, nature, and human characteristics. And that's why you find that, in primitive religion that we see even today, people worship the trees, sometimes they worship the animals, sometimes they worship the wind, and that happened back in the past and has even come into our present age, where they believe that the spirit is everywhere. You can see some tribals, people, maybe they live in an island where there's an active volcano, and they'll pray to the active volcano. Or some people, they look at the sun as if the sun is a god, and they'll pray to the god. And for certain people that live in the coast, maybe they face the hurricane, the storm that comes, and when the storm comes, they pray towards the wind and the storm. So for them, they don't have any particular God, but they believe in the spiritual world that is a strong association with animals, nature, and human characteristics. There are also some ancient primitive belief in mythical gods, like in the ancient Egyptian culture, where there's a lot of occults, or Greek mythology, Roman mythology, where they believe in Zeus and all those mythological gods that is in the ancient time. And you find that in primitive religion, there's very few written records. And most of it is word of mouth. Some other concept of primitive religion is the whole idea of believing in shamans, mediums, and voodoo. And you find that voodoo is still even practiced. Shamanism is still in practice in our modern time, where they believe in all the different spirits and so on. And the use of charms is also very, very, it's a part of a concept of the primitive religions. You have a charm to protect you from the evil spirit. And as I said earlier, some of this even exists today in our modern age, where people believe in the primitive religion and they bring it on to our current world. So we find that this belief in spiritual powers is also written in the Bible. Let's read from the Bible, what does God feel about this spiritual primitive religion? Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 15 to 19. Here Moses was talking to the Israelites. He said, "You saw no form of any kind the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. Therefore watch yourself and be very careful, so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourself an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, or like any animals on the earth, or any bird that flies in the air, or like any creature that moves along the ground, or any fish in the waters below. And when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshipping things the Lord your God has appointed to all the nations under heaven." Primitive religion. As Israel moved out of Egypt, And as they were entering into the land of Canaan, God had to warn them, don't follow this religion where people worship the spirit world, animals, nature. God was saying, don't follow them. Why? Because these are the things that God made. Right at the end in verse 19, at the last part, it says that what? Why are you worshiping idols, nature, things that God has made for all the nations under heaven? Rather, worship the Lord your God. So God doesn't want us to follow this type of spiritual beliefs. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 9, let's turn there. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practice divination or sorcery, interprets omen, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does this thing is detestable to the Lord. Because of this, the same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. The nation you will dispossess, listen to those who practice sorcery or divination. But as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. So what does God tell us in the Bible? Don't follow this type of primitive religion. And God warned the Israelites not to do that. People who follow sorceries, interprets omens, witchcraft, people who follow the spirit, don't follow them. In fact, there's a verse that talks about how if you follow this particular form of religion, it will defile you. It will affect you. You might be thinking, does spirit exist? Yes, spirit does exist. And if you read certain passages in the Bible, it talks about how even some medium has conjured up the spirit of the dead, where God says, do not do that. King Saul himself did that when he was in trouble, and when he was about to, when he was fighting against King David, and he was afraid of King David, and he wanted to know what's going to happen to him. And he asked a medium to conjure up the spirit of the prophet Samuel to question Samuel. And Samuel was so angry with him and asked him and told him, what are you doing, conjuring my spirit? The spirit world does exist, but it's dangerous. That's why God doesn't want us to follow this type or this form of religion. And let's turn to Isaiah chapter 8, verse 19. Let's see what the Bible continues to tell us. When someone tells you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not the people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? It's interesting. We as human beings can sometimes be so foolish. We believe in the spirit, right? And the Bible says, why are you consulting the dead rather than the living God that has created everything? Doesn't God know everything? So God does not want us to follow this type of belief that you see in our world today. So thank you, brothers and sisters. We will stop over here for today, and we'll talk more about the Christian faith in the part 2 in the following lesson. Okay, see you all. Bye-bye.